explain to me what evolutionary psychology is and how strong is the predictability that comes from evolutionary psychology. Could you say, using evolutionary principles, we could predict or explain human behavior to sufficient approximation, or is it like a weaker explanation? How do you see it?
Okay, all excellent questions,
Thank you.
and complicated questions. So
Yes.
I'll try to answer them one at a time as best I can, and you can ask for
Yes.
clarification further, and I will try to do that. So, at one level of description, evolutionary psychology is simply a looking at human psychology through an evolutionary lens. And one thing that it does is it has a heuristic function at one level of approximation. So, in other words, it guides researchers to ask interesting questions that otherwise wouldn't be asked, and it guides researchers to domains that otherwise wouldn't be explored.
For example?
So, one example of that would be conflict between the sexes. So, in psychology, traditionally, when you see conflict between the sexes or families where there's a lot of conflict, these have been regarded as dysfunctional and in needing couples therapy or psychotherapy of some sort. But from an evolutionary perspective, we actually predict that there will be particular forms of conflict between men and women, between step parents and stepchildren, even between parents and their offspring, their children, because in that case they share 50% genetic relatedness, but they also don't share 50% genetic relatedness. And with couples, just as one example of this, you have sometimes what's in the best interests of a woman might not be what's in the best interests of a man. So there's conflict around whether the couple should break up. There's conflict over pooled financial resources, and so we get phenomena like that have boggled my mind, like financial infidelity, where something like a third of all couples, individuals who are married, have things like secret bank accounts, credit cards where the bills are mailed to the office rather than home, and so there are various forms of conflict that are predictable from an evolutionary perspective. So can it? So basically, the rules of the game are that you propose an evolutionary hypothesis, one that's anchored in evolutionary logic of, say, sexual selection theory or parental investment in sexual selection, and then you have to do the research and you test the predictions that follow from the hypothesis. If they're confirmed, then you have greater confidence that the hypothesis is correct. If they're not, then you go back to the drawing board. I mean, was the study conducted accurately? Is there some modification that's to be made with the hypothesis, etc.? So there's nothing in an evolutionary perspective that magically gives you perfect predictability or establishes all of its hypotheses as somehow intrinsically correct. It's basically normal science. It's just like one example would be, say, in astronomy, they discovered 3-degree black body radiation, and there was a ferocious competition among theorists, among astrophysicists, to devise a theory that could explain why there was this 3-degree black body radiation everywhere in the universe that they looked. And so some of those theories will turn out to pan out, some won't, and over time you hone in on the correct ones. So, and evolutionary psychology is the same way. Maybe if I could just give an example of that, where often you have competing evolutionary hypotheses about the same phenomenon. So, and the example is the female sexual orgasm. So there's nothing in evolutionary theory that predicts females will have a sexual orgasm, but we know that it exists. Some have it occurs in some women some of the time. It occurs in some women some of the time with some men and not with other men, and under certain circumstances and not others. So what's it all about? We know that male orgasm is necessary for reproduction. female orgasm is not necessary for reproduction. So why does it exist? And under what circumstances? So there are competing hypotheses about that. One is the conception facilitation hypothesis, which says that the orgasm functions to draw the sperm into the female reproductive tract and facilitate successful conception. A competing hypothesis is that women are most likely to have orgasm with men with good genes, high quality genes. So that can be tested. And there's a paternity confidence hypothesis, so that the female orgasm is a signal to the man that she is so satisfied that she is very unlikely to cheat on him. And then there's the what I call the Mr. Right hypothesis, which is that females use orgasm as a mate selection device to select those males with whom she is most orgasmic, or if she's orgasmic with a particular guy, then that indicates perhaps that he's a good long-term mate. Perhaps he's not selfish. He's cares about her sexual desires as well and her sexual fulfillment. And so it's so anyway, these are the competing hypotheses. No, I wish I could tell you we know the answer now, but we don't. There are different theorists, and some people say, yes, there's strong evidence for one, but not the others. But at this point, it's fair game. Okay, but that's actually one way, if I could backtrack even a little bit, so evolutionary psychology proceeds in two directions. One is you observe something, just like you do with 3-degree black body radiation, and it's perfectly legitimate to come up with hypotheses about why that phenomenon exists. The trick, though, the scientific game, is you have to make predictions about things that are not known. So that's sort of one way to proceed. The other is what I call top-down or theory-driven. So let's say Trivers has this theory of parental investment in sexual selection that predicts that the sex that invests more in offspring will be selected to be more choosy, more selective, more discriminating about who they mate with, whereas the sex that invests less in offspring will be more competitive with their own sex for access to those high investing members of the opposite sex. And so that's a testable theory, and we could say, well, what about humans? Does that apply to humans? Well, we know that in our case, women have a higher obligatory parental investment. Where fertilization occurs internally within women, pregnancy, that 9-month obligatory investment, that's borne by women, not by men. And so in order to produce a single offspring, the minimum investment a woman has to put in is that 9 months of pregnancy. For the same offspring, the man just has to have one act of sex at a minimum. Now, of course, men typically do more than the minimum. And so what we would predict is if it's just purely a sexual encounter with, this minimal investment, then we predict women are still going to be very, very choosy about who they select as a sex partner, whereas men will be less choosy. They will drop their standards and be more indiscriminate.
Because they don't have as much investment in the act beyond the act itself.
Yeah.
At least theoretically.
Yeah, yes.
Right.
Yeah. Or stated another way is that the costs, the penalties for making a bad mating decision are heavier for the high investing sex. So let's say the man and woman, they have sex one night, they happen to drink alcohol, they wake up the next morning and say, boy, this was really a mistake. I shouldn't have had sex. Let's just never see each other again. Well, if the woman gets pregnant, she's really stuck with a lack of an investing guy, a guy that may or may not have good genes, possibly reputational damage associated with that. Whereas the man, the costs to him are much lower.
Yes.
And simultaneously, the benefits of her making a very careful mate choice are much higher in that case. Now, I have to add one more complexity here.
Please.
So in the human case, so this is Trivers' theory of parental investment, and it turns out it's supported in literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of species, including so-called sexual reverse species, where there are some species where the male invests more than the female. And in those species, it turns out the males are more choosy, more selective, more discriminating. And the females tend to be more aggressive and competitive for access to those high investing males. So now I have to add this important qualifier when it comes to humans, and that is that humans are somewhat unique in that we have a long-term mating strategy as well as a short-term mating strategy, as well as everything in between. So what I mean by that is that, and this is actually rare in the mammalian world, so only something like 3% of all mammals have anything resembling a long-term pair-bonded committed mating strategy, but humans do. Marriage is a human universal. People get married in every single culture and make public commitments to their spouse and invest heavily in offspring, etc. So again, the theory of parental investment says, well, if you're going to be investing a lot, you want to be pretty choosy about who you select as a mate. And so in long-term mating, both men and women are very, very choosy about who they mate with. So it's mainly in short-term mating, when it's just sex, a hookup, one-night stand, that you see this massive sex difference in degree of choosiness. And so simultaneously, both sexes, because they're both very choosy in long-term mating, both sexes are very competitive with each other for the highly desirable members of the opposite sex. And so that's what we have this, that's what makes things so interesting and complicated, right? Because we don't have, many animals just have a single mating strategy. So like chimpanzees, who are our closest primate relative, basically when the female goes into estrus and she's ovulating, that's basically the only time within that window of ovulation is the primary time when all sex happens. Males become attracted to those signals of ovulation. They have sex with the female, and then after she stops ovulating, they basically ignore her. The sexes go off their own separate ways. They don't have anything resembling a long-term committed mating strategy, even though they're our closest primate relative, but we do. So that's why humans are really somewhat unique among the primate world in having this long-term committed mating strategy that involves attachment, love, and a whole suite of other emotions, including sexual jealousy.
So, first of all, I think there's so much to unpack, and through the conversation, we will unpack quite a lot, but let me make some simplifications. What I'm understanding here is that humans are unique because we do everything from having sex for pleasure to having sex for short-term association to having mating for testing out to all the way to marriage, which is this lifelong commitment in which we involve society and government. There's a huge, broad range of ways in which humans mate that is unique in the mammalian sort of kingdom.
Yes.
Secondly, what I've understood is that evolutionary psychology is a scientific lens that looks at behavior and tries to answer from the perspective of evolution itself, why this behavior or this feature might have arisen in a species, right?
Yes. So I guess I would add that, just elaborate on that point a little bit and say that on the why does this occur? That's the issue of function, and the second thing, and so in psychology, psychologists weirdly didn't look at function of the phenomena they were looking at, but it would be like if you were a medical researcher looking at the body and you said, what is the function of the liver? And you said, well, I don't care. It's not an interesting question. Well, we know that the liver has functions such as detoxifying poisons and so forth. And
metabolizing fat, all that.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, and so you can't really understand the functioning of our bodily organs without understanding. You can't understand the organs without understanding their functions.
Right.
And similarly with psychology, evolutionary psychologists you can't understand our psychological organs or components or mechanisms without understanding what they're designed to do. That is, what adaptive problem they're designed to solve.
Right.
The other qualification I would make to what you described is that evolutionary psychology we don't just look at behavior. We also look at the underlying psychology that generates the behavior in conjunction with environmental input that activates our psychology.
Right. Right. So, from an evolutionary lens, you would say that a certain behavior or a feature arose because it was either adaptive in a natural environment or in a competitive environment. It helped me survive, therefore it exists. That's generally the logic statement.
Well, help to survive. So this gets to the issue: help to survive or help to increase reproductive success.
Right.
So because evolution is only partly about survival, but actually that's not the most important part. It's centrally about reproduction. So in a sexually reproducing species, which we are one. So you can survive to be 150 years old, but if you never reproduce, then you basically are an evolutionary dead end. And so, stated differently, everyone everyone who's listening to this is the successful descendant of a long and literally unbroken chain of ancestors, each of whom succeeded in the mating game, succeeded in attracting a fertile mate, succeeded in mutually being chosen by that mate, succeeded in engaging in sexual conduct enough to ensure conception, and ensured the survival of the offspring so that they could reach reproductive age. And so it's really reproductive success that is the engine of the evolutionary process.
So it's not just natural, it's not just competitive, it's also reproductive success, which is a core factor in the evolutionary lens.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So you can think about it as two big classes of adaptive problems. So one is survival problems, and absolutely that's critical because if you die, it's hard to reproduce. So, and Darwin actually coined a wonderful phrase that he called the hostile forces of nature, which are things that impede survival. So things like food shortages, extreme temperatures, falls from cliffs, tsunamis, etc. So things that could impede survival, predators, parasites, hostile other species, and also our own species.
Right.
So
That's competitive.
sorry,
You're right. That's the competitive force.
that those are, I would say, the survival
Sure.
forces. So because so yes, there's competition for survival, but there's also competition for mating. So and that's absolutely central. People don't like to think about that. Isn't mating as we want to think about falling in love and
The romantic part of it.
the romantic part of it, but it's actually an intensely competitive process because desirable mates are always in short supply relative to those who want them.
Right.
And so there's competition to attract the most desirable mates and be chosen by those mates.